All right, welcome to our program. I'm Jacob Hornberger. I'm founder and president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, which I founded some 30 years ago, and whose mission from the very beginning has been to present the principled case for the free society. We've got an interesting program for you today, consisting of people that have been associated with FFF either from our inception or almost from our inception. James Bovard is a policy advisor at the Future of Freedom Foundation, where he's been with us for, almost the whole 30 years. He's been writing a monthly article for us in our monthly journal, Future of Freedom, for many, many years, practically from the beginning. And he's the author of many books, his most notable being Lost Rights. He writes for newspapers all across America. He's been published in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post. He's on the board of contributors at USA Today. So he's one of these libertarian writers who has truly achieved success in advancing liberty within the mainstream press. He's going to be our first speaker. He's going to talk for about 25 minutes. And then our second speaker is Richard Ebeling. Now, Richard, when I first started FFF, Richard and I had already become very good friends. We had both lived in Dallas together. And Richard became the Vice President of Academic Affairs for FFF when we first got founded. And he later went to Hillsdale College, where he became the Ludwig von Mises Professor of Economics at Hillsdale College. And then from there he went to the Foundation for Economic Education in Irvington, New York, where he served as president for several years. And now he teaches economics as the BB&T Professor of Free Enterprise Leadership at the Citadel. So Richard's going to be following Jim with a 25-minute presentation. There won't be any Q&A after either of those two sessions. Then in the second hour at 2:10, I will be giving a 25-minute talk. And then at the end of that talk, the three of us are going to come up on a panel to do Q&A and discussion and so forth. So without any further ado, thank you for coming to our session. Jim Bovard.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Bumper for his kind words. Bumper Hornberger, I've known him for a quarter century. One of the things a lot of people don't know about him is Bumper Hornberger never flinched after 9/11. There were a lot of conservatives who said they loved freedom. There were a lot of libertarians. 9/11 comes along, and they're like, well, maybe big government's not so bad. That was never a trait for Bumper Hornberger. He always stood strong. So, by the way, I just want to make it clear that we're following Grateful Dead rules for this speech. If somebody wants to tape it, if you want to take photos, videotape, upload them, whatever you want to do, that's fine. So I wasn't sure if I would be able to make it here today for this talk. And it's through no fault of my own, of course. Maybe it was my fault that the federal government probably considers me publicly notorious. Now, this is, mind you, I'm just a country boy, I was a Boy Scout, but that didn't matter. So with the TSA has all these different watch programs. Are there any TSA employees here today? Okay. If you're a TSA employee, raise your hand. Okay, this is how you raise your hand. You raise it up here, higher, get it straight up, smile for the damn camera. So, but there's a reason that some people say that TSA actually stands for too stupid for Arby's. TSA has a number of secret watch lists. I did an article on this last year for the LA Times on their watch list number 35. This is a list that supposedly alerts TSA employees if someone is traveling who has previously assaulted a TSA employee at a checkpoint. Now, that's damn done wise. I don't recommend assaulting anyone, but something about the TSA story sounded fishy to me. So TSA said that there have been 34 assaults on TSA agents in recent years. So I called their press office, send me the list. Nope, it's confidential. I said, so can you send me the list of people who were arrested around the country for assaulting TSA agents? Nope, confidential. So I looked into that list, and it turns out there's a lot of things that can land you on that list. For instance, any woman who's traveling who pushes a TSA screener's hands away from her breast as he's checking to see if she has any bosom bombs, boom, she could be guilty on that list. Anyone who makes, quote, challenges to the safe and effective completion of screening, you're on the list. So sarcasm might be enough to qualify. And then there's a catch-all for libertarians. Anyone who has loitered near a checkpoint. No, okay, I've loitered, I admit. But the thing that was most likely to put me on that list was being, quote, publicly notorious. So, TSA thinks that they need a special watch list for people who have publicly criticized them, I guess. I've been beaten up on for 15 years. TSA chief came out and denounced me a few years ago. So, and I have to say, if I haven't made that list of potentially troublesome travelers, it wasn't for lack of trying. And it's my hunch that there might be a few people in this room who are also on that list, except for Jacob. Jacob's on the list. Bart's, I'm not sure about him. Bart goes to Fish concerts.
I'm on the list.
You're on the list. You're on the list. Okay. So 25 years ago, I wrote a book called Lost Rights. I want to thank anybody here who bought that book. You helped keep me in the writing business. The gist of that book was America needs fewer laws, not more prisons. But consider how life in this country has changed since 9/11. And it looks like I was guilty of wearing rose-colored glasses back when I did that book. TSA epitomizes life in post-9/11 America. You got checkpoint gauntlets at 450 airports. They're hassling and ravaging the rights and dignity of travelers every day. TSA's whole body scanners have doused travelers with radiation while taking nude photos of them. The scanners are complemented by aggressive, enhanced pat-downs, which have spurred thousands of sexual assault complaints. Back when the Kavanaugh hearings occurred late last year, many senators howled over the charge that Kavanaugh had pawed a teenage girl almost 40 years ago. But on a daily basis, TSA agents are out there grabbing private parts. I'm trying not to sound presidential. Okay, some people got the joke. All right, same batting average as David Letterman had in Vegas. TSA tells travelers to file a written complaint if they feel like they were abused, but TSA doesn't let journalists see their written complaints. Everything's a secret. But I found a way to get a lot of the complaints because a lot of people, especially women, have vented on Twitter about what TSA did to them. So I did some simple searches on Twitter and found a lot of very graphic complaints about women who had TSA had forcibly touched their vaginas and vulvas and left them shattered. It gets worse. The ACLU recently filed a charge that TSA agents took a Harvard grad student and a mother of three, took her to her private room and compelled her to open her pants and show her bloody menstrual pad after an enhanced pat-down. I mean, she was probably on some watch list because she was Muslim, but she was a mother of three, she was a grad student, and she had a long traveling record. And Congress has not given a damn when federal agents molest American citizens. Now, TSA, another thing I've run into over the years is they have thousands of behavior detection officers hanging around the airports looking for micro signs of terrorist intent. What does TSA consider, these terrorist warning signs? Yawning, gazing down, throat clearing, bodily odors. And TSA also, in their terrorist warning signs, TSA targets anyone who seems very arrogant and expresses contempt against airport passenger procedures. Hey there. TSA is the only security agency in the world that thinks that would-be terrorists are going to say, well, I don't like this, and by the way, I've got a bomb. So, but in spite of all the TSA is also the epitome of what the government's become, because it sees all this power, and they still can't, and they're still utterly incapable of finding mock weapons and bombs that the Inspector General testers take passive. They fail about 95% of the time. TSA can't find, no, that's a little too crude, and I was told to keep this family oriented. So let's talk about something a little more cheerful, like the American version of the novel 1984. Federal surveillance is annihilating Americans' privacy on the installment plan. The National Security Agency tracks Americans' movements via their cell phones, uses radio waves to install spyware onto their computers, and treats as a terrorist suspect anyone who searches the web for suspicious stuff. Like the Future of Freedom Foundation? That might be enough to qualify. There are so many other agencies. FBI, the media made a saint out of former FBI Director Robert Mueller when he was special counsel investigating Trump. When he was FBI chief, the FBI ravaged the Fourth Amendment. He was the FBI boss when the FBI used one national security letter, which is simply a subpoena. It's not court approved, a subpoena to get the personal data on over almost 1 million people who visited Las Vegas for New Year's Eve 2004. They didn't need a court order. It's just the FBI calling up the hotels and stuff like that. FBI threatened to grab the gambling profile of every casino guest if the casino didn't surrender the information real quick. There's other things, the FBI recently created a photo database with 700 million photos of Americans for driver's license and stuff like that. The DEA is building a secret nationwide network of license plate scanners that track where every person travels, just in case you might have bought marijuana. And as some of you heard recently, any American who crosses the border federal agents can copy your entire laptop hard drive or your cell phone data. And for no reason, simply because you're an American crossing the border. So, and in many cases, the government uses the information it seizes and these things to rob people. 500,000 Americans have been robbed by law enforcement on the nation's sidewalks, highways, and airports. Federal law enforcement agencies confiscate more property from Americans every year than all the burglars combined nationwide. And the arrogance that's driving these programs, last year in the Supreme Court, the Solicitor General of Indiana told the Supreme Court that his state would be justified in confiscating any car that drove more than 5 miles over the speed limit. And it's like, they're going to need a lot of storage facilities, because there's a lot of cars that exceed that thing. And the forfeiture laws, these are laws, there's a disproportionate effect on blacks and Hispanics and on poor people in general. Because the local state level sees stuff. The cost of fighting these seizures is very high. It often exceeds the value of what was seized. For instance, Baltimore Police made almost 5,000 cash seizures a year, over $2 million. Maryland law, if police are allowed to seize money if they say it was found during investigation. Oh, that's a good standard. That's lofty. So, the police go along and can seize almost anything if they say, dirt bikes, gambling, whatever, and they're out of luck. The police almost never return it. And, unfortunately, most people in Baltimore did not go to law school. So they are not able to understand the difference between when the police confiscate their property and when the Baltimore police are out simply robbing them. Because Baltimore has had horrendous scandals recently. There was one Baltimore cop admitted to stealing 100,000 people from people, 100,000. And there was Baltimore police had a gun traced task force, which actually placed tracking devices on the vehicles of civilians so that the gun task force would know when they weren't home so they could go and rob their homes. And this is a big scandal on the East Coast. I don't know how much is played out here, but you know, looking at my notes, you know, the next topic, this is something that I'm used to talking to East Coast audiences, and there wasn't much interest in this, but do people here care about guns and the Second Amendment? Okay, well, in that case, all right. Gun owners are America's fastest growing criminal class. 20 million Americans are unindicted felons for possessing firearms, ammunition clips, or other things politicians have outlawed. One state after another is enacting, show us the gun and we'll find the crime laws. Is there anybody from California here? Okay, you know those laws. You know, the anti-gun politicians, they've been on one rampage after another. They went and crippled Smith & Wesson. They got hundreds of Mexicans killed with Fast and Furious as a way to boost gun control here. They basically tried to strangle gun dealers and manufacturers with the Operation Choke Point, get all their bank accounts closed down, completely illegal. But, you know, a lot of politicians are now saying that we got to trust the government on guns, because that's a good response. I'm glad she's in the front row. You know, saying that the government needs more power. So let's look at what the Federal Alcohol and Tobacco Firearms Agency has done. I mean, aside from Ruby Ridge and Waco, these are folks. You know, these folks are driven to maximize the number of arrests they get. So ATF set up bogus pawn shops in school zones and bribed mentally handicapped individuals to get tattooed to promote their gun stings. The ATF has also boosted their takedowns by setting up a bunch of fake drug houses in poor neighborhoods. They've locked up more than 1,000 people after they set up these fake drug houses and basically told people that they could make $1 million in a few hours if they just go and carry out this robbery. The ATF has even given them guns sometimes to carry out the robbery, provide the cars and everything. Now, what the ATF wants to do in these raids is make sure that their targets get sentenced to at least 15 years in prison. And sometimes these are people who've never done violence before. And the easiest way to do that is to say that there's a large amount of drugs in these drug stash houses. Because federal sentencing laws are the length of sentences is based on how much drugs were supposedly involved. So if they said there was,
As I recall, by history,
hey, a heckler. So anyhow, so the ATF agents can say that at any level, and then because the person was involved in trying to steal, 15 kilograms of cocaine, boom. But it turns out, so ATF can also target whoever it pleases. And 90% of the people who've been busted in these drug house, drug stash raids, these fake operations, 90% have been black or Hispanic. And these are who the ATF has targeted. And this was also during the Obama administration. You know, when Eric Holder was lecturing us, anyhow. But as far as the biggest class of gun felons in this country, it's marijuana users by a country mile. The folks think that if their states vote to legalize marijuana, no problem. ATF says no. The federal government does not recognize state laws on marijuana. So if you go to purchase a gun from a licensed firearm dealer and you fill out the form, and there's a provision in there that says that notice that if you're an unlawful user of marijuana, you can't buy the gun. You ignore that, you fill out the form, boom. People are being arrested and prosecuted for perjury for filling out that form when they buy a gun. And there's what, 30 or 40 million marijuana users, and probably half of them have got guns. And it's understandable that gun owners would be paranoid these days. Because just half a mile from here, less than 2 years ago, you had one crazed killer who allegedly used a bump stock attachment to carry out a slaughter from his hotel window. Las Vegas police recently fired the cop who was failed to respond because he was frightened. You had a guy fire more than 500 rounds and he wasn't interrupted.
Bankruptcy back to $11 billion.
Well, that's a rough transition.
Primarily
But you had the FBI take charge, and we've heard almost nothing about it. But as soon as the shooting went down, you had President Trump vow that bump stocks are going to be gone. Trump promised we will ban all devices that turn legal weapons into illegal machine guns. Well, the ATF has repeatedly said bump stocks don't do that. But yet, and on that basis, gun owners bought 500,000 bump stocks. And now you got the president basically dictating the law and making up the law. And so you got maybe 250,000 felons, guys who could be facing 5 or 10 years in prison because they still own something the government said was legal until the president changed his mind. And this is a very dangerous precedent because Trump looks like he's getting away with this. And if this goes through, the next president could come in and say that he's decided that semi-automatic firearms, well, they're actually machine guns too, and ban all of them. This is a real peril. Senator Chris Murphy has been in the forefront of this, and he's called to ban all semi-automatic rifles. And how is it? It's a question of how folks define assault weapons. Basically, any firearm which frightens the editorial writers of the Washington Post is an assault weapon. And those guys frighten pretty easily. So we could have another 10, 20 million felons and people whose only crime is not to kowtow to politicians. And folks, the politicians who want to grab your guns, they don't give a damn about your rights or anything else. Congressman Eric Swalwell, California Democrat, wants the feds to forcibly seize 15 million weapons, firearms. He says the government should offer a buyback, and then if people don't buy them back, they should go and confiscate them one by one. Well, a conservative activist suggested that the gun grabbers like Swalwell wanted a war. The congressman replied, and it would be a short war, my friend, because the government has nukes. Too many of them, but they're legit. So this congressman did not say how many nuclear bombs he was willing to drop to end gun violence. But this is indicative of where the trend is going, that you have people suggesting this in public. And things like this made this guy a media hero, and he basically he was running. He decided to run for president, but he dropped out of the race recently because it turned out only 6 people nationwide supported his campaign. But any crackdown on gun owners is going to be applauded by a lot of politicians and activists who believe that every private gun is evil and want the government to have a monopoly on all the firearms. But it doesn't matter what people like Swalwell or Chris Murphy or the Washington Post say. It doesn't change the meaning of the Second Amendment or individuals' natural right to defend themselves and their families. The civil disobedience of gun owners is one of the best hopes for the survival of American liberty. Now, I want to, a brief personal reflection here. It was 40 years ago, almost to the day, that I first came to Vegas. And I got here about 5 a.m. in the morning. I've been hitchhiking almost 24 hours straight out of Denver. I almost didn't make it. I came real close to getting arrested twice that day. The second time by a Colorado State Trooper, me and Rodney Dangerfield, no respect. So way out in the hell in the western Colorado, there was only tumbleweeds and me. There was no traffic on that road, and I didn't see a billboard that says, Bovard, don't hitchhike on the interstate. So I figured, yeah, it was okay, there's no safety issue. Wrong. Next car that comes down the road, state trooper, lights flashing, and it's another long series of what the hell's wrong with you, boy, moments in my early life. And that trooper started questioning me, and You know, it was good practice for me because I used the same dumbass routine responding to him that I used 8 years later when I was being interrogated by the East German border guards for hours after they caught me with some papers I shouldn't have had that day. You know, I finally got to the edge of Colorado, Grand Junction, and ran to a young businessman who was, you know, really loaded up on amphetamines and was set to drive all night. So he and I would drive along, listen to his rock music, and tell me his story of his life. And I finally got dropped off here the next morning, had a 99-cent steak and egg breakfast. You know, I don't think that's the price now in Paris Hotel. You know, and I savored knocking around here for a few hours and then finally took off and hitchhiked to Los Angeles. But it never occurred to me when I was here never occurred to me when I was here back then that decades later I'd be here talking about freedom. And it's 40 years down the road. I have less hair now, but I'm better dressed. Well, mostly. Anyhow, thanks for listening and thanks for coming to the conference, and I look forward to your questions later on. Did you want to borrow the hat? Sure. Thanks.
I had just taken a position at the University of Dallas in Irving, Texas, and the chairman of the department, a fellow named Sam Bovard, had been tutoring Jacob in some of the classics of economics. Adam Smith, David Ricardo, John Stuart Mill, the founder of the Austrian school, Karl Menger. They were going to do human action, Ludwig von Mises' human action. And I had just been hired, and Sam Bovard recommended that I should do that with him. And I wasn't particularly interested in doing it. It's a new job. I was a lot younger then. I had new classes being assigned to me, a lot of preparation for courses I hadn't taught before. But then he told me the fee he would pay. So I said, okay, great. And so I started off being very diligent. You know, well, paying me money and having to be conscientious. You know, like start out outlining the chapters as we would be, you know, that we'd be discussing for the day. And so he'd come to my office at the university, and about 10 or 15 minutes into the discussion, we would veer off. He'd want to know my views on this libertarian issue and that libertarian issue, and was I a leaker and a compromiser, and well, that was that. And this is the way it ended up being every session. So like, I ended up realizing I didn't have to prepare for anything. So, you know, remind myself as in a chapter, say a few words, and then we're just going to talk about these political things. And afterwards, invariably, he would say, let's go out for lunch, and he'd pay. Now, this went on, what, a year and a half or something. And then he's offered a job, as he'd been practicing law in Dallas. Yeah, he was chasing those ambulances. He was working as a lawyer in Dallas, and then he was offered a position as a program director at the Foundation for Economic Education, and he left. You have no idea how depressed I was. Here I was getting good pay for no work and a free lunch, and he was gone. But that's how Jacob and I first met. Now, it was shortly after that, and this is sort of part of the themes that I want to talk about, I had been offered a position at Hillsdale College in Michigan as the Ludwig von Mises Professor of Economics. And it was at that time, in 1990 and 91, that I had and a colleague from Hillsdale who taught political science and was himself originally from the Soviet Union. He and I were invited to be consultants on market reform and privatization in the Soviet Union, mostly with what was emerging as a democratic freedom movement in the Soviet Republic of Lithuania. But he also ended up doing consulting work with the Russian parliament and the Moscow city government on these issues. But during those visits, I ended up experiencing a lot of Soviet life. And one of them was that in August of 1991, I was in Moscow doing the consulting work, but also visiting the woman who I was eventually to marry. My wife is Russian. I met her there. And it was when, those of you who are old enough in the room, the hardline communists were fearful that Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms, try to give socialism with a human face, was going to bring about the end of the Soviet Union, and they undertook this hardline communist coup attempt to prevent any further reforms of his type. And that coup went on for 3 days in the middle of August 1991. My future wife and I were at the barricades with Russians at the Russian Parliament building in the center of Moscow as Boris Yeltsin rallied the people of Moscow to stand up for what was hoped for a new democracy and a freer Russia. Now, the coup fortunately failed, the hardliners were defeated, and the day after the coup had ended, a massive rally was called behind this Russian Parliament building, in this vast square. And it must have literally been hundreds of thousands of Russians who were there. And at one point, they had all these anti-Soviet and anti-communist and dissident speakers, and talking to the crowd. And at one point, everyone looked up, and the communist flag was coming down from the top of the building, the red flag with the yellow hammer and sickle in the corner. And in its place was the traditional pre-communist Russian colors of the old flag of Russia, which, by the way, is also red, white, and blue. And suddenly, from this crowd, emerged this chant in unison, this ocean of people, Svoboda, 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 which is Russian for freedom, freedom, freedom. After 75 years of communism, these people were hoping for a society that would be, quote, normal, as they referred to us. We were considered a normal society. What did a normal society mean? You could say what you want without being arrested. You didn't have to worry about the secret police coming in the middle of the night and knocking at your door and you or your entire family disappearing with knowing what happened to you. Or a system that left you dependent upon the Communist Party for your life opportunities and your standard of living and your ability just to get by. Now, as we all know, Russia hasn't turned out as hopefully those Russians had hoped for with Putin and everything. But they had experienced socialism for decades following the Bolshevik Revolution of 1970, almost 75 years of that. What they wanted was more of a society. Did that mean they had a clear and consistent view of what a free society should be like? But they had a sense that what they had was the opposite of what they would want. Fast forward to today in America. Fast forward to today in America. The public opinion polls say that anywhere up to 47% of people in the United States say that they have sympathetic or positive views about socialism. The numbers are a majority among those under 30 years of age. Among Democratic Party members, or those who lean Democratic in terms of their voting, it's about 60 to 65%. Among ethnic groups, among whites, that number is about, the total population, about 35 and 40%. Among African Americans, according to the Pew Research Center who did this poll just recently, 65%. Hispanics, almost 55%. Why would they have this open sympathy about a system that if you had seen the old Soviet Union, you would expect that no one would want to return to that past as another country's future? Well, part of it, I suppose, is ignorance. Part of it is ignorance. Ignorance in the sense that people don't learn about these things. If you turn on the History Channel on television, they have numerous and very well done documentaries and historical accounts of the experiences of Germany under the Nazis in the Second World War, and the tyranny and terror and the mass murder. The Nazis did kill 6 million Jews. They killed 3 million Poles. They killed 500,000 gypsies. They killed over 10 million Russians and Ukrainians. And we're not talking about soldiers. This is all the civilian deaths. And they killed 300,000 good Germans who were considered to be biologically impure with mental or physical defects. And they killed another 250,000 who might have been good physiological Germans, but they didn't share the ideology of National Socialism and obedience to the Fuhrer. And the History Channel has done wonders in other programs and documentaries on television about the horrors of the Nazi totalitarian system. How many have been done about the Soviet experience, what socialism in practice has meant. The 68 million people killed in the Soviet Union, men, women, and children, declared to be enemies of the system. The estimated 25 to 30 million who at one time or another occupied and were used as slave laborers in the Gulag concentration camps that were sprinkled across the Soviet Union. The 11 million kulaks, that is small property-owning peasants, who were starved to death or shot to death in Stalin's war to institute collective farming in the early 1930s. Does anyone see documentaries about that? No. Because the intellectual climate in the United States for a very long time is that, well, they were a little rough around the edges, and you really want your sister to marry Stalin. But in essence, they had good intentions, and it's all an embarrassment. So let's not highlight what was said. It really wasn't real socialism, not the socialism we want. And then there are the ideologues, those who really believe that society must have imposed upon it a central plan. Like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, right? AOC. I don't know how many of you caught it, but last weekend in the Washington Post magazine, they interviewed one of her senior staffers. In fact, I forget his name, but he's like the one who sort of discovered her and got her, persuaded her to run for that office, the congressional position in New York. And he said, this Green New Deal, this environmental stuff, that wasn't even really in our mind. We saw it as a way to change society. It's a ruse. They believe that it is necessary to impose central dictatorial planning on humanity to create what they view as a good, just, and moral society, in which, of course, they will be the masters and we will be the obedient drones and servants. And that is what their intention is. The Green New Deal proposal and legislation that was offered in Congress earlier this year is an outline for it. Every American business would be placed under the correct government command and control to redesign what it produced, how it produced, where it produced, with what quantities and types of inputs and raw materials and machinery, so as to protect the environment. Everyone would be assigned to a position, a job, with a guaranteed wage, a certain status, a position, with guaranteed levels of redistributed income outside of whatever the wage may be. There would be no corner or facet of society not controlled and commanded by the state. It is the same model that was experienced and practiced in every Soviet-style socialist regime on the planet, in the Soviet Union itself, throughout the Eastern Bloc captive nations, today still in North Korea, the residues and forms of it still in Cuba. That is socialism. What they've added to this is a new veneer that in fact is even more dangerous at one cultural level. You see, the communists and the socialists, they talked about class warfare, class conflict. What was its basis? Well, there are those who own the private means of production, land, resources, factories, and then there's the mass who are propertyless. And they must go to the factory door and knock on the door and beg entry from the evil capitalist owner, because if the propertyless worker is not allowed entry so he can use a machine to produce stuff, he and his family will starve. But the businessman, merely because he owns, extracts unjust and exploited profits from him. so that if the worker produces 10 units of output during a day, the evil capitalist extracts, let's say, 3 or 4 units as his right merely for owning the factory, and the worker must be satisfied with only a fraction of what his labor has really produced. Right? That's the socialist theory of exploitation. That was the basis of all of this. But there's a problem. America and Western Europe today is not the image of the Industrial Revolution in the early 1800s. We're not in the midst of a Great Depression with 25% unemployment and poverty and starvation, stalking the land of so many. No. The fact is, we are a prosperous, well-to-do country in which even the poorest person in the United States lives like a king compared to the kings of the past, and hundreds upon hundreds of millions of people in other parts of the world, in what used to be called the Third World. So how do you make this pitch for class conflict when it's really a society of the middle class, and those who are lower middle class or poorer, they're not interested in revolution. They're interested, if you talk to them and have their expressions in public opinion polls, of being middle class themselves, or maybe they or their kids could become part of the 1%. And that's their goal and ideal for themselves. So how do you use Marxian class analysis to arouse the masses, when the masses want to be the capitalists? So now there's been a twist to this. It's not class and class warfare. It's gender and race identity politics. Who you are, what you are, is no longer the class to which you belong per se. That's still part of the terrain of the ideology. Are you white? Are you black? Are you Hispanic? Are you male? Are you female? Are you straight? Are you gay? Are you crippled? Are you not crippled? The litany of these distinctions. And now, these define who you are, what your status and place and position and privileges should be in the society. It is the return to a crude tribalism. A crude tribalism. You know, the Marxists would say, the old Marxists, that you are a product of your class. You can't help acting and believing and fighting for your class interest. Either the exploited capitalist, if you belong to them, or the exploited and starving workers, if you are part of the proletariat. Now the attitude is, do you think black? Do you think Hispanic? Do you think white? What privileges do you have or don't have? Do you have a proper, female consciousness? If you're biologically female, or if you feel that you're female. If you're male, you cannot have, except being exploitive and sexist in your baby. It's in your makeup. Well, is that not a variation of the same identity politics that precisely we saw under the Nazis? Are you a good Aryan? Are you part of the master race? Or are you one of the inferiors, the vermin Jews? And you can't help it, you're born that way, and you can't help thinking that way. So their new socialism is a perverse and twisted form of the National Socialism of tribal identity, but now sanctified, made righteous. These are the dangers that we now face in our society. By people in the general population who really, unfortunately, don't pay much attention to history, don't have an opportunity to see documentaries about what socialism was like in reality, and are easily drawn in. Well, everybody believes in fairness, right? Everyone believes in justice. It's bad, to just, be bigoted towards somebody, So they play upon those guilts to then create this identity politics of tribal collectivism, within which only a socialist economic system can achieve the goals they have in mind. This is the 21st century challenge to liberty. It is a challenge to the principles and ideas and vision upon which this country was founded. Those words, we hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal, And I know it sounds strange, but at that time, and for most of the time since, when that phrase was used, it was man to mean men and women, mankind. All men are created equal. They are endowed with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Notice, these rights belong to individuals. You are, first and foremost, a unique, distinct, special, individual human being, possessing these rights to your life and your liberty and your honestly acquired property to pursue and prosper in your life. And these are rights of the individual that don't belong to people who speak English or happen to have come from British ancestry or happen to worship to a particular denomination. No. It's declarative of all human beings everywhere. Everywhere. And that was the purpose of the Revolution and then the principles in the Constitution. And those especially highlighted in terms of rights in the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments. Ours is a country founded on individualism, the recognition that society is nothing more than the composite association of individuals, and that each of those individuals has rights that cannot be violated. Rights to his life, rights to live his life peacefully and honestly in any way, shape, or form he chooses, as long as he does not violate the equal rights of those who are his fellow members of the family of humanity. And that he is free to enter into any association, relationship, interaction that is peaceful and voluntary and mutually agreed upon, as such as those in the marketplace, in which people decide what to produce and what to consume and what to supply and what to demand and what to buy and what to sell and at what prices. And not the state, based upon collectivist identities and arrogant political paternalisms of some claiming to know how all of the rest of the humanity should live. Liberty is challenged today. Liberty has been challenged many times in the last 100 years, and with great threats of totalitarianism. But this is the new version of the same collectivist threat in a tribalist totalitarianism that is based upon Marxism, but has returned to a race and gender component that then will straitjacket each of us in our life as human beings. Never before has it become as important for us to know what liberty means, why it is important, and we need to defend it and speak out for it. Because if not us, it will be gone. Thank you very much.
All right, that concludes part one of our program. Part two will resume in 10 minutes with a 25-minute talk by me, and then we'll have the balance of the hour with a Q&A discussion period. So we hope to see you back in 10 minutes. Thank you for attending part one. Okay, welcome to part two of our program, The Ongoing Destruction of American Liberty. I'm Jacob Hornberger. I'm founder and president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. And our mission from the very beginning, some 30 years ago, has been to present the principled case for the free society or libertarianism. One of the amusing aspects of this dust-up between President Trump and the 4 Democratic Congresswomen has been, for me, President Trump's statement that we live in a free society here in America. We have freedom in America. If you don't like it here, you can leave and go elsewhere. And then the other part is that he will never permit this society to go socialist. Now, the reason I find these statements amusing is because conservatives honestly believe that they do live in a free society. And this is one of the things that distinguish us libertarians from conservatives. We have broken through the indoctrination. We know the truth. We know that this notion that we live in a free society is absolute nonsense. But conservatives are still victims of the indoctrination that they received from the first grade. And they're genuinely convinced that they live in a free society, they thank the troops for defending their freedoms, and that America has a free enterprise system. And this notion that America is going to turn socialist and that Trump's going to stop it from happening because these Democrats are imbued with socialism that they just want to bring to the United States is equally nonsensical. That train left the station a long time ago.
Yeah.
Now, of course, in a pure ideological sense, a socialist system is one in which the state owns everything. That's the way it is in Cuba. I've been to Cuba. It's bizarre to see everybody working for the government. Everybody. Because the government owns everything. And North Korea, and that's the pure socialist concept. But socialists knew that they could never get that type of thing going in the United States. That Americans had such a deep legacy of private property that they would never go along with that kind of system. So they were willing to settle for a system that had an ever-increasing number of socialist programs involved. And that's the thing that they devoted themselves to from the very beginning with the progressive movement in the late 1800s. Now let's look at some examples of this phenomenon and see how different libertarians really are from conservatives, and what it is that we need to do to achieve a genuinely free society. We live in a society that's based on mandatory charity. That is, where the state mandates that Americans will be good and caring. And the instrument for this mechanism is, of course, the Internal Revenue Service, where the government takes money from one group of people to whom it rightfully belongs and gives it to another group of people. Now, this is an embodiment of the Marxian principle, from each according to ability to each according to his need. Taking money from those to whom it belongs, or wealth, and giving it to people to whom it does not belong, but who the government feels need it more. Now, there is no way to reconcile a free society with mandatory charity. Impossible. If you're being mandated to be good and caring to somebody else, you cannot, in any logical sense, consider yourself to be a free person. A free person is one who has the right and the freedom to keep everything he earns and decide for himself what to do with it. If he wants to help his parents out, if he wants to help the poor out, so be it. But he's not forced to do so. Freedom entails necessarily the liberty to say no. If you're not free to say no when it comes to charity, you're not free. Now, the crown jewel of this system, of course, is Social Security. Now, notice the name of this program, Social Security. That's not a coincidence. It originated not among Madison or Paine or Adams or Washington or Patrick Henry. It originated among German socialists in the late 1800s. And the progressives imported this idea to the United States as part of their movement toward socialism. And it was then adopted in the 1930s under the Franklin Roosevelt administration. Now, contrary to what seniors have convinced themselves, or what they've permitted public officials to convince themselves of, Social Security is not a retirement program. It is a straight welfare state program, no different from food stamps and education grants and farm subsidies. Nobody contributes into Social Security. This is what I call the conservatives and seniors living the life of the lie, the life that denies reality. Nobody contributes into anything. The government collects taxes in one form or another, income taxes, excise taxes, tariffs, Social Security taxes, FICA, whatever, and all those taxes are spent in the year that they are collected. And from the very beginning, Social Security, the law is very clear on this, it's been a straight welfare program. It's based on taking money and wealth from the young and the productive and giving it to the seniors through this coercive apparatus of government. So there's no fund where people contribute their money. There's no lockbox at Fort Knox where it has your name on it with all your Social Security contributions. The money's gone. That's taxed from you to fund things like the Vietnam War and Social Security payments to people who are now dead, and the Iraq War and the Afghan War and the military. It's gone. And so Social Security is a straight transfer, confiscate and transfer program. It embodies what the French free market legislator in the 1800s, Frederick Bastiat, called legal plunder. Now, there's not a conservative alive that is opposed to Social Security, including President Trump. just naturally there's no Democrat or liberal or progressive that's opposed to Social Security. They're all fiercely committed to this program, even while conservatives say, we're never going to let socialism enter the United States. You see? This is what's called the life of a lie, the life that denies reality. It's no different with Medicare. Straight socialist program. You know, and notice the fight that goes on between Republicans and Democrats. You know, oh, should we abolish Obamacare? Should there be Medicare for all or Medicare for some? But notice something significant. Not one of them calls for the abolition of Medicare. That's only we libertarians that do that. You see, because if you're going to achieve a genuinely free society, that necessarily means that you've got to examine what the infringements on liberty are. I mean, if my dream is to have every single American family across this land in the upcoming presidential election debating and discussing within their families one important question. What does it mean to be free? What does that really mean to be free? And what is the role of government in a free society? Who asked that question among all the presidential candidates? None of them. Because why? Because they naturally believe they're already free. They hear us libertarians and they say, what are y'all libertarians about? And we say, we're about freedom. What? What? We live in a free society. Boy, you libertarians are really weird because we already have freedom. But you see, a free society necessarily entails a dismantling of infringements on freedom. If all we do is succeed in polishing, modifying, reforming, fixing infringements on freedom like Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security, we've achieved nothing with respect to freedom. Oh, we might make life better for the serfs on the plantation, just as making life better for the slaves in the 19th century plantations might have been better for them. But it's not freedom. Freedom necessarily entails determining what are the infringements on freedom and ditching them, abolishing them, dismantling them so that people are free to establish their own healthcare systems without government intervention. So it entails a repeal of Medicare, Medicaid, occupational licensure, income taxation, where people are free to keep their own money and determine their own healthcare and their own retirement and their own charitable decisions. Should you honor your mother and father? I mean, how many times have I heard conservatives say, oh, Jacob, if we abolish Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, there'd be people dying in the streets. You see, it's a gigantic insult against millennials. It's saying, you millennials are bad people. We know that you would never honor your mother and father by helping them on a voluntary basis. We can't have freedom in this country because you people are bad people and we need to force you to be good and caring through the coercive apparatus of the federal government. And why millennials go along with this is beyond me, because they're financially strapped, they can't start families, some of them are delaying marriage because they can't afford it, they can't save any money, they live paycheck to paycheck, and yet they go along with this socialist nonsense. Public schooling. There isn't a conservative alive that doesn't believe in public schooling. And of course, the liberals are firm advocates of public schooling. Yet it would be virtually impossible to find a better example of a socialist structure than public, i.e. government schooling. I mean, this is a socialist apparatus. It's based on the concept of central planning, whether at a local school board level, state level, national level. And you've got coercive attendance. Through compulsory attendance laws, you've got compulsory taxation that's funding this process. You have government establishing the curriculum, the textbooks. You've got all the things associated with the Army, regimentation, order, authority, deference to authority. I mean, it's your classic socialist system. And so if you want a free society, you necessarily have to think at a higher level. You have to think in terms of separating education in the state, separating healthcare in the state, separating retirement in the state, separating charity in the state, by dismantling the public school system. Now, what have conservatives done? Now, conservatives, rightly so, they see the disaster that public schooling does to kids, and especially in terms of destroying their passion for learning. You know, every kid from 0 to 5 has this passion for learning. But by the time he's 18, that's gone. That's wiped out. He hates school, he hates learning, he just wants to get out. And so what has been the conservative answer to this? Vouchers, which is another socialist program. It's a program that takes money from one group of people through taxation and gives it to another group of people to whom it doesn't belong. So in other words, they're fighting socialism with socialism. And always saying, thank God we live in America where at least I know I'm free. See, and saying, we'll never permit socialism in America. Come on, we've got this gigantic socialist educational system. The Federal Reserve, monetary central planning. We've got a great book by Richard Ebeling, who you heard in the first hour, called Monetary Central Planning in the State. The Federal Reserve is just a socialist institution. It's based on monetary central planning, where bureaucrats are possessing what Friedrich Hayek called the fatal conceit, that they know how best to handle monetary decisions that infect millions of people. I mean, this is why we had monetary chaos. It's why we have the stock market crash in '29, the Great Depression, the booms and the busts. Not because of the failure of free enterprise, as we're all taught in our public schools, but because of the failure of this socialist institution, the Federal Reserve. Immigration controls. Classic example of a socialist program. I mean, here you have the government planning the number of immigrants that are going to be allotted to each country and what their qualifications are going to be. See, this is, again, Hayek's notion of the fatal conceit, that they can actually plan this complex labor market involving millions of people. And so is it any surprise that you have what Ludwig von Mises called planned chaos in the area of immigration? You have this huge backlog of immigrants trying to get into the United States because of the laws of supply and demand, but they're all stopped up there at the border. This is classic socialism. This is what socialism produces: chaos, crises, mayhem, death, destruction. I mean, one of the most glorious and honorable positions the libertarian movement has ever taken, as opposed to Democrats and Republicans, conservatives and liberals, is our position in favor of open borders. Why? Because there's people dying in the desert in the Southwest, trying to get into the United States to sustain their lives through labor or improve their lives through labor. Dying crossing the Rio Grande, including children. Dying in the backs of 18-wheelers. I've seen this crisis. I grew up in Laredo, Texas on the border. I've seen this immigration crisis firsthand since I was a kid. Our farm was on the Rio Grande. We hired illegal aliens. They were among the hardest working people I've ever seen. They were our friends. They played football, my brother and me, after we finished working in the fields and stuff. And I never could understand why these people were being put in jail just because they were trying to sustain their lives and improve their lives. But that's the system. It's a socialist system. It's a central planning system. And so anybody that thinks that, oh, all we need is comprehensive immigration reform, I just laugh whenever I see that term, that the mainstream media, oh, why won't they enact comprehensive immigration reform? If you take away nothing else from this talk, take away this. There is no reform that's going to make their system work. None. You can put the most brilliant immigration experts in the country in a room with the 100 most powerful computers. You can leave them there for a month. They will never figure out how to get rid of this immigration crisis because their socialist system is inherently defective. Now, you've got Democrats saying, we love the poor, needy, and disadvantaged while they're treating immigrants like this. And then you've got the conservatives, the Republicans saying, we favor free enterprise and free markets. Open borders is the free market. It's the free movements of people in accordance with laws of supply and demand. That is free enterprise. Is enterprise that is free of government control and regulation. That's what free enterprise really means. And it's the only system that is consistent with loving thy neighbor as thyself, loving the poor. And you couldn't find poorer people than illegal immigrants. And yet here are Trump and his Democratic opponents arguing over whether there should be a Berlin Wall or a Berlin fence. The whole thing's ludicrous because their system will never work. The only system that's going to work is freedom. And so if you want a free society, you necessarily have to think in terms of dismantling infringements on freedom, not reforming them, not trying to fix them, not trying to make them work. And finally, there's the national security state. The Pentagon, the CIA, the NSA. Now, you couldn't find a better example of a socialist structure than the military. It is a socialist structure. Milton Friedman pointed that out many, many years ago. Here's a system that engages in assassination, including of Americans, torture, including of Americans, indefinite detention in military dungeons, including Americans. It is a system that has destroyed our freedom. Not, oh, it's destroying our freedom. It has destroyed our freedom. The USA Patriot Act eviscerated the Fourth Amendment. The secret surveillance schemes. All of these things are attributes of a totalitarian society. Everything that these people do is inherent to a totalitarian society. You go to North Korea and you will find China and Cuba and you will find secret surveillance schemes. You will find torture. You will find assassinations, executions without due process. Everything you find under this system of government. And conservatives and liberals have the audacity to say this is part and parcel of America's, quote, free society. You cannot have a free society under a national security state. It's impossible. You have to make a choice. Do you want freedom or do you want a limited government republic? Our founders understood this. This is why they brought into existence with the Constitution a limited government republic. If you had told them after the Constitutional Convention that the Constitution was going to bring into existence a national security state, a Pentagon, CIA, military-industrial complex, military bases all across America, military bases all over the world, a welfare state, a drug war, they would have laughed. And they would have said, see you later. They never would have approved the deal, and they would have continued operating under the Articles of Confederation, which was a governmental system where the federal government didn't even have the power to tax. Okay, so why have Americans chosen all of this? Well, because it's the age-old problem of security versus liberty. Do you want security or do you want liberty? You can't have both. You got to make a choice. And every American's got to make a choice. If you want liberty, then you got to get rid of Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. But you see, that's where the security thing, oh, Jacob, I want security. I want that safety net. Because I think people are going to die in the streets if we abolish these programs. Your concept of liberty is too dangerous, Jacob. Too dangerous. I don't want liberty. I want the security of that safety net. Same with public schooling. We get rid of public schooling. Everybody could be dumber than they are today. You know? I mean, just think, people not learning how to read and not everybody just being stupid and playing video games and stuff like that. Oh, no, Jacob, we need security. Legalize drugs, as you libertarians want to do? Oh, my gosh. Airline pilots would be flying, taking heroin every day, and doctors would be operating on brains and stuff with under cocaine. Oh, no, Jacob, we need the security that drug wars bring us. That's the only reason why pilots and doctors aren't on these drugs when they're doing their procedures. Oh no, we need the Pentagon and the CIA. Jacob, don't you know the terrorist threat? Oh, never mind that it's our interventionist policies that are producing the terrorist threat. You know, yeah. We need security, Jacob. National security. National security is everything. Just like it is in North Korea and China and Cuba and Russia, all of which are national security states. So you got to make a choice as Americans. And that's the choice I'm presenting to you. It's a question that every American has to answer. What do you want out of your life? You've got today forward to the day you die. Do you want to live that life with meaning, which means a life of liberty? Or do you want a life of so-called security, which really comes with no security at all? Americans live under the most powerful government in history, an omnipotent government, a government with omnipotent powers, and they're the most frightened people in the world. I mean, where's all the security if everybody's so frightened? Is liberty dangerous? You darn right it's dangerous. I mean, people could, everybody go on drugs tomorrow. And everybody turns his back on his parents and his grandparents and refuses to help them out. Everybody refuses to get educated. Terrorists could come and take over America, or Muslims, or illegal immigrants, or drug dealers. They could take over the public school system, or whatever. Is liberty dangerous? You bet it's dangerous. But the alternative is worse. Because look at the police state that this system has brought into existence. The immigration police state on the border, where you got highway checkpoints that stop people who have never entered the country, warrantless searches of cars and ranches and farms, stopping Americans at the border who are returning from vacation, demanding their cell phones and their passwords, and subjecting themselves to body searches, the stuff that goes on in public schooling, the Social Security system that is bankrupting the young people of this country. It's not too secure. Now, is it possible to achieve a free society? People say, oh no, Jacob, not possible. And that's when I talk about the 19th century, where I say, okay, it's not a pure libertarian society, and I want to make that real clear because there's been libertarians criticize me whenever I point that out. It's not a pure libertarian society, and there was slavery in the early part of the century, and there were other violations. Women didn't have the right to vote. But they achieved a society in the 19th century which was different from any other society in history, notwithstanding the violations, the crony capitalism, government-business partnerships. They had a society with no income tax, no IRS, Federal Reserve, drug laws, immigration controls, gun control, drug war, Federal Reserve, on and on and on. If they could do it, then it's not pie in the sky. It's not impossible to achieve, because if one group of people has achieved it, another group of people can achieve it. And that's the challenge that I present to you. Do you want to be free or not? That's the question I'd like you to go home and think about. If you decide you don't want freedom, that you want security, so be it. But at least you're making a conscious choice. If you want to be free, then you have to ask yourself, how bad do you want to be free? And if you want freedom bad enough, then the only way to do it is to start talking to friends and neighbors and everyone else about what that means. That necessarily means a dismantling, not a reform, of infringements on freedom. And I think that if there's enough of us that take this pure, principled approach to achieving a free society, that we have one hell of a good chance of leading not only this nation, but indirectly the world, which is mired in statism, to the freest society that mankind has ever seen. Thank you very much. Okay, let me invite our speakers back up and we'll open it up for discussion. There's a microphone right here for anyone who has any questions. Richard says he's going to be the centrist. Okay, questions, discussion, comments, critiques, all are welcome.
I live in probably the most Republican conservative county in the country, Madison County, Idaho. I'm on the local planning and zoning board. It's a constant battle. I could ask anybody in the county and in my city who would typically vote Republican if they want a smaller government, and 9 times out of 10 they would. But every time an issue comes up in the form of a property zoning issue or Airbnb or anything of that nature, it's very depressing. The amount of government on a very local basis that they insist on is extremely depressing, and I'm feeling like a very lone voice, even though I have some minor influence in a small town. And I'm always hoping when I come here when I see people around here that think similar to me, I get some hope. But even in a very small conservative city that I come from, it's extremely depressing. That's not a question. It's simply a comment, and you can you can rebound if you'd like. Thanks.
Are you familiar with Isaiah's Job by Albert J. Nock?
I know Nock, but I don't know the book.
It's an essay that he wrote that is absolutely fantastic. And when you were talking, it reminded me of Isaiah's Job. That Isaiah says to God, look, you've got me out here charged with spreading this idea that you want me to spread, but nobody's listening. Everybody's against it. Everybody's opposing me. That what's the point? I really think I should just give up this job you have me doing. God says, you stick right with what you're doing, because there's a lot of people that are listening and digesting and reflecting on what you're talking about. You just don't know that they exist. He says, but I know they exist. So you just keep doing what you're doing, and you keep doing what you're doing in Idaho.
Yeah, I'd like to make a comment on that. Thanks for mentioning the Albert J. Nock thing. For a different perspective on the prophet Isaiah, read Voltaire's Philosophical Dictionary. Anyhow, didn't work.
Hi, Jacob.
Hey,
Talk
I want to show you what I'm giving to stick it to those Democrats and everyone. I'm sticking to them. Listening to you is like coming to a libertarian revival. I'm telling you, I haven't developed libertarian yet. I am a hypocrite. 3 examples. I am a retired postal employee, and I'm collecting civil service retirement, which is another word for Social Security. Back in February 2017, I went to the International Spiritual Liberty Conference or whatever, and I went there from New York to Washington, D.C. I traveled by government railroad, aka Amtrak, and shortly after I returned, I had a heart attack, okay? And I needed quadruple bypass. The bill was like $100,000 and change. Guess who paid for it? Medicare. Thank God for Medicare. Now, I think everyone here collects something from the government, right? Okay, now, can we consider ourselves hypocrites? Ayn Rand would say, no, this is reparation. We're getting payback for everything that we take from taxes and our liberty. How do you feel? Is that a good idea to look at this like that?
Yeah,
I feel hypocritical.
That's an excellent question. I never think in terms of individuals who are participating in government programs. I mean, I guarantee you I didn't use government highways to get here. I've used a private helicopter to bring me. And I send all my letters by FedEx, not by the Postal Service. And look, you know, people on an individual level are on Social Security, they're on Medicare and so forth, and there's different variations of how people manage their way through this welfare, warfare state type of life. My position is that regardless of where you find yourself in this spectrum, postal employee, IRS employee, who I knew one who was a libertarian, it doesn't prevent you from standing and advancing the genuine case for the free society, which means abolition. So that even if you're on Medicare and Social Security, you can still advance and promote the idea of abolishing it. And I don't think that's hypocritical at all. I mean, I think each person's got to make his own decisions as to where he draws the line. Does he, you know, they've cornered you on healthcare where you almost have to go into Medicare unless you want to go uninsured. They've destroyed so much of the private healthcare system. Each person's got to make that decision out of a point of conscience. But there's nothing to prevent you and everyone else from standing firmly on abolishing this program, even if you're on a program.
I can sort of add to that. Let's take the extreme case, and since I talked about it in my presentation, such as the Soviet Union. There was no private property in the Soviet Union. Everything was owned and produced and distributed by the state. You had an apartment, state allocated, because every apartment building was owned by the state. Healthcare, you had nothing but state healthcare. They had their single payer system. Education, the state was the only educational source. You couldn't have private education of any sort. You can go down the litany. Buying your groceries, everything was the people's retail stores run by the government. Now, what if I happen to know that during those Soviet times, they were a small group, but they were relatively well-informed and in themselves consistent classical liberals, libertarians. They couldn't opt out of that society. Where are you supposed to live? Where are you supposed to get medical treatment? How's your kid going to learn the ABCs? How do you get food? When the state has co-opted so much, they have put you into the corner that you must rely upon the provision of what they're offering for you just to survive. You're a victim. Now, obviously, we're not that extreme in the United States, but the fact is, if you think of how much money the federal government and state governments take for Medicare and Medicaid, and therefore leave you so little afterwards, given the other expenses of everyday life, if you have families, that you have little recourse except to fall back on their system. They tax you. So what if you cannot afford to send your child to a private school as a second tuition after all that the government has taken out of your pocket to fund government schooling? You have no choice often. So I don't think that it's hypocritical. They boxed you into a corner in terms of options and availabilities and the money they've left in your pocket that you often have no choice but to do this. I mean, how do you travel without being on a government road, whether it be a county road or the interstate system? And all that you can do as a person who believes in liberty is to understand why this is a wrong and undesirable system in yourself, and then in conversations, exchanges, opportunities to share ideas, explaining why the existing system, which you have to suffer under from, and which has made you a dependent in these forms, should be abolished, and persuade your fellow citizens that this is not the system either that they should want to live under.
Yep.
You know, as a generalization, I agree with your juxtaposition of security and freedom, but I think you have to make a finer distinction than that, because I think when you start talking about security, you're going to lose, particularly when people think in terms of security, in terms of violence, you're going to lose most of the audience. And to me, the real threat is the loss of freedom in the name of economic security, where you have Social Security, you have Medicare, you have Obamacare, et cetera, so that politicians can make the argument for giving up freedom in the name of economic freedom. So I appreciate your comments.
Well, I think when they're making that argument, they call it freedom, but it really is, what they're really doing is saying you're going to be more secure under this system. They call it a safety net, which indicates that it's a high wire act, and if you fall off the high wire, don't worry, because the government's got the safety net there. And yes, they call it freedom. I mean, that's why I was saying that they believe they live in a free society. They call this free enterprise. Well, Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security and public schooling and all the things we've talked about as central bank, immigration controls are all part of the system in Cuba, North Korea, China. And so I think the first thing is that people have to become aware that this is not freedom. The great German thinker Johann Goethe really captures the plight of the American people of our time when he says, "None are more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe they are free." I mean, what greater slave could you have than a slave who thinks he's free when he's serving you? I mean, he's going to be thanking you for his enslavement because you freed him. I think that's the problem here, is Americans think all this is freedom because they've been told it's freedom. They've been indoctrinated as freedom. Now, if they discover what we libertarians have discovered, that it's not freedom, what do they do then? Well, they might well say, I want this system of security, quote, security. Okay, but at least they're making a choice. Right now, Americans don't realize they're making a choice because they think it's freedom. They think they're, by promoting Social Security and supporting it, Medicare, Medicaid, they're supporting freedom. It isn't. Yes, sir.
Every law that's passed is a loss of freedom. So most people are willing to compromise some freedom. That's why I suggested that you have to focus on the loss of freedom in the name of economic freedom specifically.
Yeah, I just don't call it economic. I mean, to me, economic liberty, economic freedom, is a way of life that is free of government control, where economic activity is free of government control. They, like the word liberal, which used to mean libertarian, they're distorting that term by saying that really you're free when the government's taking care of you. Well, I challenge that. Economic freedom, or free enterprise, is enterprise that is free of government control and regulation. It is free of this so-called security. Jim, you have a comment?
No.
Okay.
Hi. I own some real property. I own a house, a piece of property. I can say pretty much who comes on that property and who doesn't come on that property. And so I guess, who owns public spaces? And since who owns public spaces, who says who can be on public spaces? I guess in a way, this is one way to look at immigration.
Okay. I mean, certainly people out here in the West understand public ownership of the resources. I mean, I think government owns, what, 60% of the land out here? That is not private enterprise. That's not private property. That's a socialist system where the government owns all this property. Now, in what we really have in America, I've often heard people say on immigration that there's nothing wrong with putting a wall around America because in our private homes we have walls. and we have doors, and we have locks on our doors, and therefore the federal government, as part of our national home, is locking the door and building a fence, just like we do with our private homes. Well, the problem with that analysis is that it looks at America as a national homeland, like Cuba. I mean, in Cuba that makes sense because the government owns everything. America was founded on the principle of private property. So people have a right to, under principles of private property, to invite whomever they want onto that private property. It's my home. If I want to associate with a Guatemalan, I have a natural God-given right to pursue my happiness. That's what the Declaration of Independence points out. The pursuit of happiness is a God-given right that adheres to all men and women. So if I want to invite a Guatemalan under my freedom of association, I have that right. It's my property. That doesn't mean that you have to let him into your house. You can lock the door. But you can't stop me from opening my door to whoever I want. And so we're a nation of private property. Mixed into that is government lands. But you've got roads that connect private property. And we happen to live in a country where the government has chosen, we've let the government run the road system. But we've also adopted a policy that when the government has property, it's not going to discriminate against people on race, color, creed, national origin, sexual orientation, or any other principle like that. That if the government's going to own the roads, it's got to open them up to everybody. We don't want the government to be discriminating against Jews or Catholics on the use of the roads. It's equal treatment for all. Now, you have a right to discriminate against people into your home, but the government doesn't have the right to do that. So when people are crossing roads, like from Maryland into Virginia, crossing the border, they're not violating anybody's rights. They're going from private property to private property. There's 10 million immigrants, illegal immigrants in the United States. They're not sleeping in public parks. They're not sleeping in public roads. They're sleeping in privately owned facilities where people have chosen to affiliate with them or associate with them. And so that's the concept of open borders. It facilitates freedom because people are free to cross borders, in which case they're not violating anybody's rights, and they're going from private property to private property, either a private business where they go to work or a private home where they live. But it's all by consent. That's how a private property order works.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate the sort of insight. Please explain how you juxtapose the concept of citizenship with this concept of freedom, particularly as it pertains to immigration. And of course, this is clearly pertinent now with the census coming up. What is citizenship as you envision it? What is the value? And how does that intermingle with freedom as you perceive it?
Yeah, that's a great question. Citizenship and immigration are totally different. Totally different.
Oh, citizenship and freedom.
Did I say freedom?
You said immigration.
Yeah, citizenship and immigration are totally different concepts. Okay? The mere fact that you have people free to move back and forth across the border doesn't mean they have to become a citizen. I mean, I have a friend who's Japanese. She's lived in America for 30 years. She speaks with a thick Japanese accent. She's still a Japanese citizen. I don't care. What do I care that she retained her citizenship? Her kids are Americans, but there's 10 million Americans living in Mexico. Most of them refuse to assimilate. They keep their American citizenship. They don't learn Spanish. They eat burgers instead of enchiladas. They cheer for American sports teams. They pay taxes to the IRS. Who cares that they don't become Mexican citizens? So conceptually, under open borders, people would free to come here seasonally. They pick crops or whatever. They respond to laws of supply and demand. Wage rates are skyrocketing in Oregon because they need crops picked there. They go back to Mexico. Now, if they want to become citizens, okay, but there's no pressure on them to become citizens. They're foreigners living abroad, just like many Americans live abroad. And then you can set whatever restrictions you want on citizenship. I don't care. You want to make them as strict as you can. You want to make that test as hard as you want. Fine. That doesn't concern me at all, whatever controls you want to put on who becomes a citizen. I just want to get rid of the controls on the movements of people, even if they don't become citizens.
You talk about citizenship, okay, there's a controversy over having that question in the census. Are you a citizen? They're worried that these people won't answer the census because they're going to lose representative in Congress. But they forgot something else about census. It's supposed to be relating to direct taxes. Direct taxes are supposed to be apportioned based on the census. Now, no one seems to have any idea what they're talking about. How would you imagine a direct tax would be apportioned based on the census? By the way, this is a battle cry. Remember the battle cry? No taxation, no representation. This is how it's taken care of. So how could you imagine a direct tax apportioned based on the census? Any idea?
Well, keep in mind, I'm a libertarian.
What is the Constitution? You like the Constitution, I imagine.
The Constitution's nice, but it's not my shibboleth. Liberty is my shibboleth. And therefore, I oppose any taxation, direct or indirect. I don't think it's ever justified to force anyone to fund something he doesn't want. And I believe in limited government, but I also believe that it should be voluntarily funded. And I've written a piece on this. You can go to the Future of Freedom Foundation's website. I've got an essay called Why I Favor Limited Government. On the apportionment clause, I thought that was repealed with the 16th Amendment. Well, some people say it was. That's how we got the graduated income tax after the 16th Amendment was enacted, when they abolished the apportionment restriction. But I really don't know how the census works. I'm not an expert on the census. As far as I was concerned, I thought it was just to count the number of people in the United States to apportion representatives, not to apportion taxation, but to apportion the right number of representatives in Congress. But
apportion direct taxes.
my understanding is the census has never had anything to do with taxes originally. It was always about counting the number of people so they could determine how many representatives would come from each state.
It's right there in Section 1, Article 2.
I could be wrong.
1 and Section 2, Clause 2.
I could be wrong. You guys have any comment on that?
Yeah, I'm not that familiar with the question of the taxation and census. I was a census taker back in my wayward youth, about the same time I was hitchhiking. And I've written about it. I've done a few stories for Wall Street Journal and USA Today on how the Census Bureau was used in the Japanese American Roundup in the 1940s, put them in concentration camps. And there have been suggestions that similar things should be used. The answer should be used to round up Muslims or Iranians or whoever. So there are a lot of dangers with a very expansive census form, which has become basically a ticket to expand the welfare state because it shows all these social needs, supposedly. But personally, I'm in favor of a minimal census form, but if we don't have a minimal census form, I think it's fine to ask about citizenship. So.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Yeah, just briefly, I want to say philosophically, I agree with you. We're on the same page. I think the only difference I see, the problem, is that to have the society you envision, it entails a group of people that operate at a higher level of consciousness. Obviously, the system that we have in place is a system that basically brings out the worst in the sense that it gives people that, and I don't think anybody handles power well, but I think many of the people that become, shall we say, the guardians of power, they want the people to not understand, obviously, and then they don't understand themselves. They don't understand that the system that they put in place is a real impediment to progress, on this planet for people to get ahead. Instead, the problem is that the power has the corrosive effect. As Lord Acton aptly observed, he's right, that power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolute. And I think the system, we get into, is it socialism? To be honest, I think here in the United States, it's more fascist in many ways. My private joke is that Germany, the country, lost the Second World War, but fascism won, because people were able to see how efficient it could be to achieve certain aims. So the problem is that it isn't, I have nothing against tilting at windmills. That's fine. And I think people, we all need to, as you said, to speak to other people and maybe educate them, but there's a different way to think of things and point out the problems with the system that we have. But the problem is that people that want power over others always need to have a system in place that gives them that power. And those people, those institutions, don't want to part with that power. And I think that's where the tilting at windmills kind of comes in. And I don't know how that can be addressed. I mean, to me, in a sense, it's a dressed up feudalistic system, would be another way of looking at it. In other words, as you go through the centuries, the players have changed, what they call the system has changed, but the end result has similarities. You look at the Declaration of Independence, in my opinion, an inspired document when you stop pointing a way to have a civilization that would be better. But the problem is, of course, that when you then have that institution, almost from the beginning, you could see the federal government in this country starting to expand its foothold.
We have 4 minutes. Okay, it is true that there's always elements in the human psyche, in particular certain human beings, of wanting power. I mean, that's been the history of humankind when you look at it that way. But the fact is that it's possible to think of other ways, and people have overthrown tyrants and tyrannies. In the American case, it was a moment in history when there were a group of prominent people in the society who had an intellectual appreciation of what was blossoming, and the idea of individual liberty, and the idea of separating everyday life from political control. And that system was put in place. And it is true that given that there was always people who want power, there was always that going on in early America. But what was also present at the same time, and that is also very clear, it was the culture and the attitudes of the people throughout a good part of the 19th century. And that is, they were against that type of encroachment of the state. People, if we could go in a time machine, and if you could have a Pew research survey of public opinion at that time of, let's say, the 1840s or the 1850s, do you believe the government should be involved in healthcare? Do you think they should have Social Security? Do you think they should provide public housing? Do you think? The vast majority of Americans would have said no. It is not the duty and responsibility of the place of the government to abridge, interfere with, and intrude into the private and voluntary choices and actions and enterprises of a free citizenry. So it's been people's attitudes and beliefs that have influenced. Do people who want power try to indoctrinate people that they should view that as good? Yes. But people have a choice to rethink these things and to put those types of paternalistic governmental policies in a small corner and give themselves degrees of freedom. It has happened in the past, it can happen in the future.
Right, and ideas have consequences. Why are you here at this conference? Because you're interested in liberty. And you to be doing that, it's not just an intellectual enterprise. Deep down inside you, you would like to see a free society.
Well, that's not very much work.
And so the question is it possible? Now you call it tilting at windmills, but it's people who have subscribed to principles and ideals that bring us freedom of speech and freedom of religion and freedom of the press and the First Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, due process of law, habeas corpus. All those things have been achieved by people, a small minority of people. They remain committed to principles and ideals. Can we do that? You darn right we can. We just need to get enough people that take that principled approach and then overwhelm those who are seeking power. So those of us who want liberty versus those who want power. They have won so far, but that doesn't mean they'll win tomorrow.
That's good.
We're out of time. I'm very sorry for the last questioner, but I'm getting signals here. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.